Nieba kunle dolishin yenden kunge gemba bo semjen kunge nyen chigo tamche kenla gunchan omen jegi inge podane dusum sange kunge ngobuni rasim chego musumadun sembe sabe lame shabla so wide. Dambiche Yamsulembe Kulong Sampo Nejung Dan Chanju Simdan Dembe Koni Dambiche Sembrishu.
In the context of practicing the sublime and precious Dharma, we need to cultivate the pure or correct motivation, which consists of renunciation and bodhicitta, the mind of awakening. So with that motivation, please listen to the following.
Nyamlin Shu Nyamlin Chi Yongdu Tawe Tenla Pap Nani Kombe Gyun Yongbe Koni Nyamlin Chi Kukuyore Tadenani Tandanganzu Tawe Tenla Wabe Kabsuni Dini Shubi Kabri.
When we're practicing the Dharma, the sublime Dharma, we have to pay attention to establishing the view. Establishing the view then leads to sustaining that view, and that sustaining of the view is what we call meditation. And it's through this process of coming to terms with the view and sustaining that, that's what we mean by practice. And so currently we're talking about how it is that we establish the view.
Della Teni Rimba Sumyure Sani Nawa Semimba Tenla Pap Sim Ranshin Meber Tenla Wap Teni Tadula Nasim Nibuti Sumju to Tenla Wapake Rimba Sumki Kani Dangazu Dukure.
So the way in which we ascertain the view or come to terms with the view, gain certainty in the view, requires 3 steps. The first being to establish that all appearances are mind, that the second step being establishing that the mind is empty, it's absent of inherent nature, and ultimately the third step being coming to terms with recognizing the unity between appearance and emptiness, appearance and this lack of nature. So it's through these 3 steps that we have the responsibility of attaining or coming to terms with the view. As of now, we have completed, or we've talked about the first of these stages, that being establishing all appearances as mind.
Nawa Semimba Tela Jungna Tokpa Menatini Kowachi Lebitoni chue nyamlin che bai na den chue de lam do wa ya bu chung go re den de da khasang ga dos ge she chini shu bare.
So for most of us, when we're practicing, we're learning how to practice, of these three ways or these three steps of ascertaining the view, we begin with the first, that being establishing all appearances as mind. We begin with that and we work with that. We come to terms with that because specifically it's very helpful to begin at that point. It's because it's a positive and beneficial way of thinking about practicing. We begin here, and it's important that we emphasize that point, that it's at this it's with this ascertainment of the view that we begin.
Ta penna nga zu dacha shu chumbo ji ge yong de dacha ti rang na yin ba ngo shen na lam sa de la de ni tang jin control che ki ko kap ji ra gre she dang ya de ni ge yong de she dang de rang na yin ba ha ko na lam sa ji de la che ki ko kap ti yore ta dacha ta she dang ni ga de ni je yul ge ngone dembar tu tu ta tu jin de ba na de ni dacha de chue la khale khaw go yore la she dang de ya chue la khale khaw go yore.
For example, when strong attachment arises, strong desire, perhaps, if we recognize that this is I'm going to translate rangnang as self-appearance, or self-appearance in that it's not appearance of an external object, but of one's own mind. So this self-appearance, we establish that this desire is merely a self-appearance, and immediately we can gain control of the situation, having recognized that it's a self-appearance, right? We gain immediate control by having that recognition. Same for anger, aggression, aversion. We recognize that this is a self-appearance, and with that we can correct that. We can change our state of mind, right? When objects of desire or anger, aversion arise, normally we cling to them as being true, really real things out there that are solid and real. And with that kind of attachment, that clinging to things as being real and true, it's extremely difficult to change our situation, to gain control, say, of the situation. And so it's through this recognition of self-appearance that we have that ability to control.
Adi ranang se sikdi anju damngang la sobe kapsula su sem gi tsal se gda the display of one's own mind. The yin che du to display se di.
So yes, this word I'm using as self-appearance is in Tibetan rangnang, and this is a term that we find quite often in the pith instruction traditions, and it's essentially one's own personal, we could say display. It's this activity, this potential that we have. But as Khenpo translated, let's think of rangnang as the display of one's own mind, and that's a nice way to think about this term rangnang.
Laso, tani dering tani nipa sim rangshin mebar tenla baba asni. Tadi ma shukins.
So today, we're going to talk about the second step of ascertaining the view, which is recognizing that the mind is empty or lacks inherent existence.
Tini ta nawatam je semina. Tini sem korangi ngowodi kareres. Tini sem di tini dembar dubarebe, ranshingi dubarebes. Labaina. Tini mares bare.
So if it is the case that all appearances are mind, what is the nature of that mind? Is it true? Meaning, is it inherently real? Does it have its own inherent nature? And to that we say, no, it does not.
Tini semgi ngowodi ta tulsa di shiyores labare tadi yobar zimba mebar zimba tini yimbar zimba ta mayimbar zimba asni ta ngaranso semgi neluk di kandere do sni taje tanyong du tulsa di shiyore 아니 semgi ngowodi kareres di shinangni kanya rungwa jirebesna shiga kanya mares di memba di semgi ngowres nilugres ni desungbare.
So when we talk about the nature or the essence of the mind, we need to ascertain on what grounds on what grounds is there confusion about this? And what do I mean by that? When it comes to the nature of the mind, we could cling to it as being existent, having existence, versus not having existence, being non-existent. We can cling to it as being something or not being something. So it's on these grounds of existence versus non-existence, being something versus being not something. That's how we would cling to it. And when we analyze, well, how is it? What is the nature of the mind? We look at all those possibilities of existence, non-existence, being something or not being something, and we can't find grounds for it to be in any way like those four options. So not seeing that it is like that, or not like any of those options available, that is exactly what the nature is. It's being free from those all those possibilities.
So basically it is saying that if you ask what is the nature of mind, it cannot be described, but there is a method. It is not one of these four things or four extremes or the clingings. That is not. So actually it is not saying what is the nature of mind, but it is saying that what we think is not a nature of mind. And there's these four possibilities. Yobata mepa, yimbata mimba.
This is these four terms are actually quite difficult to translate in English, but it's these four options of having existence, not having existence or being non-existent versus being something versus being not something.
I think it's in the root, but I don't know how they translate it.
And yes, in the roots verses we have these words coming up as being non-existent versus not non-existent, and that's half of the equation. I'll look at how the other options as well.
So basically, it's kind of like, let's say there's a person who is a color, let's say is a by birth colorblind, blue, and he sees only two colors, black and white. Now, if we have to explain this person, what does it mean by color blue? It doesn't really matter how many different kinds of blue you point out. What he will see is whether black or white. So it's almost impossible to explain this person directly what is blue. Does that mean that we cannot do anything? No. We cannot point out exactly what is blue, but we can help this person by explaining that you point one thing and say, do you see this? Maybe this says a white. This is not blue. And then you point out the other thing, let's say, which might be black, and you can tell this person, this is not a blue. This person still cannot directly experience what is blue, but at least it will give this person the wisdom that whatever he sees is not a blue, and blue is something beyond his experiences. And this is exactly how we explains Tatal,
Being free from extremes.
being free from extremes, because it cannot be explained directly, so we talk about which is not free. So by understanding which is not free, you will block a lot of wrong paths, and it will indirectly helps you to so chances of being mistaken become less and less every time you reduce this one of extremes. So to sum up, you cannot explain what is blue, but explaining person black and white is not a blue, will help this person to ultimately realize by his own self-realization what is blue. Tandela Gyurme ki tatang Gyurme ki tas ni yore, ta tangbo Gyurme ki tati pangbe pangsulti.
So, out of these four possibilities, we're starting with the first two, which is the possibility of existence versus the possibility of non-existence. The other two being the possibility of being something versus not being something.
Ta tangbo di yoba main kewe kyang masik meba main korde kunji shi galdu main sungju umelam taral semgi chungin tokar sho so.
In the Mahamudra aspiration prayer, where we've arrived at the 11th verse, which states, "It is not existent, as even the victorious ones have not seen it. It is not non-existent, as it is the basis of all samsara and nirvana. This is not a contradiction, as it is the middle way of unity. May we realize the dharmata of mind free from extremes."
Tade sungdi ona semgi ta nawa thamje semina semse di dembar tutup tardu aransula nangi yore dembar tutup tardu yore be selaba ina yobe ki chechigre be selamna tardu ki neludi de mares garresna sem yobadi ani sanje ki kyang sigyo mares.
So having established that all appearances are mind, what is the nature? What is this mind? This mind we normally cling to as being true, real, solid. It appears as that, right? Despite appearing to be something that is actually true or real or solid in any inherent way, is it like that? Is it true that it is existent in the way that we think it might appear? And ultimately, this is not the case. Ultimately, it doesn't exist in that way. As it states in the first line, it is not existent because even the victorious ones have not seen it to be so. They have not seen it to be existent.
And deki yobita pangsul tembare.
So this first line is talking about how, in what way we abandon or let go of clinging to the extreme of it being existent.
Tini ona ta semse di ji mepa chigrebes yoba maina ta ngarang so namjun namdo man cheba lamsang yoba mare selamondu mepa jre samni jindu gerwa ona semse di kayang chiyang mepa sawa nyini chi ngowo mepa jile mepa dendre chi ta namjun ngarang so chi 중 만용마 깨 만용마 세그와 덴데기 추 일본게 라다 모심기 부스네 베트니 샤그와 덴데지 레베스 라바이나 데양 마레스 카레레스나 셈세지 여바송자 코르와당 냥데 나와당 출바 차상 나라주 연구 열어봐 데니 셈데 메나 아니 코르와당 냥데 율당 율제 당 하나주지 가야 메바레스니 랍투베미도와 초르기 요래 용기 요래 시기 요래 랑리랑 살 연구 요래 덴바 인도드니 메바레스니 짐샤바디야 출발레스 라바레 메비 타지레스 데가서다 지양 메바지.
So, having eliminated the possibility of it being truly existent, then we think, well, because it's not existent, does that mean it's non-existent? Right? Normally that's how we think conceptually, right? If you say something doesn't exist, then we have the automatic assumption that, well, then it must not exist. Right? This is normally how we think of things on a conceptual level. But it's not like that, right? It's not that the mind is completely, absolutely, complete nothingness, in a sense of being complete blankness. It's not that it doesn't have a certain kind of functionality to itself. It's not even that it doesn't have a certain kind of nature or quality to itself. It's not like that it's completely absent of those that nature, that experiential nature. For example, it's not like the horns of a rabbit, or a son of a barren woman, right? Things that aren't possible, that are completely impossible, that have never once arisen or been in the experience of somebody. It's not like that. Rather, it's because it does have a presence to it, or a quality of existence, we could say, that we see all the appearances and displays of samsara and nirvana, as it says in the second line. Because there is this display, this experience, it's not that it is completely non-existent either. There's the experiences of objects. Not only that, but the experiencer of those objects, the subjective side of things, is also experiential. We can't say that that's completely doesn't exist, right? We have our own personal experience of these things. The mind itself has this quality of being self-aware, self-clear, cognizant, naturally, automatically cognizant. We can't deny that being the case. So from that perspective, we can say, well, the mind doesn't completely is not completely non-existent either.
Tadeyang dordina mepar redu sambati mepar zimba chire semji ngowati zimba 탐절을 다와 임바인데 되니 매바양 차게요 말이.
So regarding this point, if we were to assume that the mind doesn't exist, that assumption is itself clinging to non-existence. And because the inherent nature of the mind is free from all clinging, is naturally free from all clinging, it can neither be this either. So it can't have this clinging to things as being non-existent either.
다 아주 빼디 가상돼 되니 타다 두징이 셰바 갑솔라 둘디 나와나신 여레베스나 여바야 말와 출비방게 낭샤바 짬치그래 되니 다 둘디 자와니니 메바레베스나 자와니니 메바야 말와 출경기 강사 나신베 갑술라 나와 셔 연구요레 셔라바 나신기 직바케발라서 백인 자와양 지겨요레 대나신지.
If we think back to the example of the snake and the rope, the snake doesn't exist in the way that it appears, right? From that perspective, we can say that the snake doesn't exist, right? It's merely a mistaken perception of a confused mind, right? A projection of that kind of mistaken mind. So from that perspective, we can say that it doesn't exist. But, on the other hand, can we say that the snake in no way whatsoever exists in some way? Well, that's not the case either, right? Because from the perspective of the confused mind, it does seem to appear, right? And not only that, that appearance functions in a certain way, right? It evokes a certain kind of response in the one that sees it, right? So from that perspective, we can't say that it completely doesn't exist either.
teni ta sumba di ta tende ina di tokpa lamsang kare yung ko resna ta di sigi mares yobayang yobata meba ni kalbarwa teni yoba mainna 인지 미지 메바 인고 그래 메바 마인나 인지 미지 여바 인고 그래 여바양 마인 메바양 마인세 니부디 아니 데데 취지 세기 말에 사바이나 갈기도 스네 띵기요나 다 제당 아주 니징기 로그 왕도제나 덴바라와 갈기래 이내양 니루그 왕도제나 되니 갈기 말에 슬라바래
So with that being said, we immediately might have some objection to that, being that, well, that's impossible. How can something both be existent and non-existent in the same time and it not be inherently a contradiction, right? If you say something doesn't exist, if you say that it doesn't exist, then I'm going to say that it does. That it, how do you say, that it doesn't exist, right? If you're going to say, well, it doesn't not exist, then that means it exists, right? You can't have two at the same time, right? These are inherently contradicting ideas. And yes, from the dualistic perspective, this is true. Existence and non-existence are contradictory statements. They're contradictory states of nature. But from the way things actually exist, from the way things truly abide, their true nature, from that perspective, it's actually not a contradiction, that it's both not existent and not non-existent.
Pena tangi petela chitang dul yobayang yimba dul mebayang yimba nigaji sigi marwa yana dul yobayang ko gore yana dul mebayang ko gore mana so nyijing logi timda de jebai ina yang di sigire slabare duse chikla pena kande resena galgi mares dul 둘도 난긴 간사 코랑기 거네 셔바이나 둘 여바래 이내양 닐루게 왕선데 제바이나 둘 낭심베 갑대가 랑라더니 둘 메바라와 둘자니 뚝거나 요마라와 이내양 둘 통경의 간사 그거라 둘디 개체게 여바래 다디니 갈기미도 와둘 랑기 고 마투 빠테당 아니 간살은 둘도 나와니 보디 아니 여바야래라 메바야래 뒤세 다가랑라 잘랑 아주 숭죽세 봐 낭신도 똥바 똥신도 낭바스
So when we think of the example, right, of the snake, either the snake exists or it doesn't exist. That's how we normally think of, say, in general, a snake, right? If a snake is there, then it exists. If it doesn't actually, it's not there, then it doesn't exist, right? It's simple. But that is the way that that the dualistic mind functions. The being both existent and non-existent are contradictory states. But in actuality, in some cases, it is possible for the snake to be both existent and non-existent. And how is that? Why is that so? You have to look at the perspectives here. The perspective of the observer, right? From their perspective, they're experiencing the appearance of that snake, right? So from their perspective, it's there. right? It's something to be experienced. But in actuality, in truth, right, because the snake is just a projection of that person's mind, it actually doesn't exist in the way it appears. So from that perspective, there's no snake there, right? And but again, going back from the perspective of the one that sees the snake, 100%, they think that it's really truly there, right? And so we have these two states going on. We have the state of the way things truly are. There's no snake. There's no established snake in any by any means. From the perspective of the individual seeing it, it's there, right? So, and one moment, at the same time, you can have this snake in this particular example, both being existent and non-existent. And so, with that example, that's how we can think of unity, the non-divisibility, the indivisibility between these two things. That while existent, it is non-existent. While non-existent, it is existent.
Tatal simgi chunyi di teni mingdi karita shabaresana tendeki yobe tala malungpa mebi tala malungwa dila tatal sini mingda shabare ume sini mingda shabare deyang mingda paramado tatal koranya ngoni tatal mare sidi ta yobata mare tu mebata mare tu de tatal redu sambayna deyang digiyo mare ta inayang aransu communicate je gugurwa ming chita gugurwa ming de kare ta sha paresna tatal sene ming ta sha pare na tatal resha sambe jimba shuna ya ta matar ba cha pare.
So there's some terminology that comes with talking about this state, the nature of mind. We talk about this as being the nature of the mind being free from all extremes. It's quite pithy in Tibetan, but essentially what it means is to be free from extremes is to be free from the extreme of inherent existence and being free from the extreme of inherent non-existence. We call this freedom from extremes. Sometimes it's even called simplicity. We also call it Uma, this Madhyamaka, the middle way. And so these are terms that we use. In actuality, it is the case. But there's the danger of saying, oh, the mind, as you say, is free from extremes. It is free from extremes. If we cling to it as being now something, and that something being, this word we call, this term we project onto it as being free from existence or free from extremes, then we've fallen into clinging to it as being something yet again. We need to communicate, right? We have this problem of needing to communicate using words and terminology, but at the same time, there's the danger of then again not only we of again falling into this idea that it is something, and that is it being free from extremes. So if we cling to it as being like that, then we've again fallen into extreme.
Total se sik di goyong du Juba kakpati lola shagwara mato Dubaji lola shagyu mebare Dubaji lola shana Dubata mada bachaware Di indu nganzo Shemba shida nangla Zimba juna tawa min sung sharwa Tadi tatu segarwa nganazo
We have this other word in Tibetan, tudel, being free from exaggeration. Again, I think we can use the free from extremes. This word is meant to communicate that it's to eliminate any possibility of there being it existing in any one of the extremes, right? It's the elimination of any of those possibilities. When we use this terminology, it's free from the extremes, it's free from all projections, it's not meant to then subsequently then through the back door establish it as being something, right? Again, it's merely a negation of all these different kind of possibilities of being existent, non-existent, etc., right? And so if we then establish it as not being any of these things, but then again through the back door establish it as being just that, then we've fallen into extreme yet again, right? And as it says in the four lines talking about the four ways of parting from attachment, we have this line: if there is clinging, that's not the view. So right, this is an ultimate statement of what the view is. If there is clinging, that's not the view.
So basically, if you ask, what is the nature of mind? You have two options. The best is you say nothing, and if you have to say something, the turtle is the only equivalent word, the nearest word. This is the best word that you can use, which is not exactly correct, but better than nothing.
This term turtle being freedom from extremes or projections.
So in Buddha, also after he became enlightened, he thought there's no point to talk. But then second thought came up, and okay, better to say something. Then he started saying that sabshi turtle wasal dumaje duzitabu choshing dakini sula tenyang goar minibest mama desongwa.
After the Buddha attained enlightenment, he made this statement that I've found a dharma, a nectar-like, amrita-like dharma, which is profound, uncompounded, luminous, completely free of all stains. Because if I were to say this to anybody, try to explain it or teach this to anybody, they wouldn't understand. Because of that, I'll just stay silently and rest in the forest.
Actually, when we talk about the nature of the mind, more you try to explain, more you make it polluted. But unfortunately, as a normal human being, we have to use the words. This is the only communication system we have. If you are Vidyadhara Bodhisattvas, then they have a different communication systems. They call it Gyud Lama. Unfortunately, we don't have that. We are not in that zone of communication system, so we have to use the best word that is equivalent, at least.
And those two terms being the lineage of direct transmission and the lineage of showing symbols or symbols.
So mind lineage and symbol or sign lineage. Tại như vậy thì hiện mình kita sẽ.
So next comes talking about the extremes of being something versus not something.
다 지당 유매당 유매니부디 그래서 그래요. 인도 삼로다운디 여바당 매바스디 셈코랑디 율다버질 샤니 디 여바레도 매바레도 스니 제바제베소라고 지르도와 데니 임바당 미미타스디 아니 셈코랑기 닐루디 검용디 셈코랑기 닐루디 검용디 아니 율진 코랑기 인 삼바지다 어디 민 삼바지기 된데가 전화 이용 거래서 내 니버디한테 니가 타지래 손발에 니가를 대바지고 그래 손발에
when we're talking about the extremes of existence versus non-existence, when we relate those states to the mind, we normally relate to the mind as a kind of object, an object that either exists or an object that doesn't exist, right? And the point being, we need to eliminate both of those possibilities as being the way the mind actually abides, the nature of the mind, that it's not an object which exists versus doesn't exist. When we come to the two extremes of whether or not the mind is something versus not being something, as it has here in the text, this is it, this is not it. It's by relating to the mind as a subject, right? When we meditate on the mind, using the mind, right? When we investigate the mind using itself to observe it, there are two extremes that we could fall into, being that, it is a subject which is this, versus it is the subjective experience which is not this, right? So these two extremes can come into play especially when we're meditating directly on the nature of mind with the mind. And it's quite clear here that this is a more subtle kind of clinging.
Pena tangi semji ngodi tongni yin de gomgiye sungju yin de gomgiye yana semji ngodi la yishe sini segiye tangi yishe de gomgiye sambadawaji yin bi kone kombayna simbacharu delladini chomba asla ko kandaji di yin sambi zugu sa진 게 연구 덴데기 짐바데당 달바텔라더니 임바르 짐비 타당 타와스.
So, for example, when we're meditating and we have this idea that my mind is empty and I'm meditating on my mind being emptiness, or I'm meditating on my mind being the unity of emptiness and appearance, etc. Or I'm meditating on my mind as being non-conceptual, primordial awareness, right? These are what's happening here in that context when one's meditating on the mind being something. You're clinging to the mind as being whatever you're meditating on, right? It's a label that we then put onto the mind as being, okay, that's it. It's something that you can point to and be like, okay, I'm meditating on the mind being this such and such, right? And so in that way, that's how we fall into the extreme of the mind being a particular something.
Nibati Mimbitasana Ni Semdi Temper Tupa Kagni Temper Tupa Mare Tende Yamba Song Santa Temper Tupa Ti Kagni Ani Ni Gomgi Sambaina Teni Dela Kagbita Segre Temper Tupa Se Ti Maimbare Samni Zimbaina Deyan Zimbache
And alternatively, the extreme of the mind not being a particular something looks like, for example, we establish that the mind doesn't truly exist. It doesn't inherently, it's not a solid, real thing. And so having eliminated or refuted or rejected that idea, then we say, oh, I'm meditating on the mind not being truly existent, not being a real solid thing, right? We cling to that experience of saying, oh, I'm meditating on it not being something. This is to fall in the extreme, say, of rejection or elimination, refutation, right? The clinging that, oh, it's not a particular something.
Tandordina Tangbo di main di in somebody tini Drubi Tarwa Kochik Sula Chun Yungore Zimbare Di main sedi Tini ko Kakpatang Kakpeki Chachire Deyan Zimbare Tindi Ngazu Gomki Tik Dinsunangla Gautupki Bechul Kayang Mache Pachini Dini Rangbap Susha Sigrwa Kakpa Inayang Rangbap Sumasha Wachadogore Duba Ine Rangbap Sumasha Ko Nika Garre Chue Machi Chadwa Tila Dini Ngazunamji Mache Rangbap Sini
So we could say that by thinking that the mind is a particular something, that falls into the side of the extreme of establishing or asserting some kind of label or way of representing the mind in a positive light, we could say. And that itself is a kind of extreme, a kind of clinging. Conversely, by saying that it is not a particular something, that it's particularly not something, that is to fall in the extreme of negation or refutation, rejecting some kind of way in which the mind exists. And again, that's a kind of extreme and a way of clinging. In the meditation manuals, we hear instructions that say to the effect, be without accepting and rejecting, and be within or rest within a very effortless state, without rejecting, without accepting the mind being in any way. So it's by resting in a state which you're neither rejecting, you're neither accepting anything, is what we mean by being uncontrived. And we there's a word or a term that we see a lot. It's called maju rangbap, and maybe we can translate it as something like rest naturally as it is, without contrivance, or rest naturally as it is.
Ta Tende Yindi Yin Sambayana Chare Men Sambatiang Chubik Zimbachre and the Nika Dan Dalokone Shapana Tini Maju said Charu. That day Antona Dordina yin se di nganzu dodo dang kurdeb ni yebe nane dodo ke zimba tawa shirwa men se di kurdeb ke zimba tawa shirwa 근데 ni dan tan ne rangshin se de cha do gore
So when we talk about this term of contrivance, right? If we were to think and cling to the mind as being something, that's a kind of contrivance. We've contrived it being something. If we cling to the mind as not being something, again, we've done another kind of contrivance. We've contrived it to be something, not being something, right? These two kinds of contrivances are a way of clinging. To be free from either of these kinds of contrivances is what we mean by being uncontrived. You're not doing anything contrived by saying it is or is not a particular something or not something. And when we talk about when we say that it is something, what we've done is we've exaggerated what it is. It's been a projection of exaggeration, meaning it's we say that it is something when it's not. And then conversely, to say that it isn't something, we've in a way denigrated the nature by saying that it isn't something which it is. So both of these kinds of ways of clinging are extremes that are to be eliminated.
So maybe in Tsumba sena aranso eats se da wordwa
Okay.
kakwa sena is not se da wordwa
Mao Tsana no Tsuna Tsun.
nadela Tsumba tang kakwa se jurwa
Yeah. So the idea of saying that it is something is to kind of have mean that we're representing representing it as something. It's like a label that we've attached. Conversely, by saying it is not something, we're rejecting it being in some way.
According to Buddhist pramana, valid cognition system, the language in general, especially human language, is very elusive. That's why language works very well, because it doesn't have to be a reality. And you can assume anything. And that's why it works very well. The more elusive the nature, the language becomes more communicative. So that's why when we talk about the reality, language actually becomes very difficult to use because it's almost the opposite. So, semanang lata, da, den, debar zimbe ke tokpa segrwa language ki component awati. Di sum di tsayong be kapsula nganzo inada screen, projector, ani di koji process di yako chungsuna ani da video di pe yako yongorwa. Di nashin chene da dang, den dang, ba cha di tsu dom yong de kapsula. Then it functions very well.
Within the pramana tradition, or the tradition that we talk about logic in, the way of using language comes down to a process of conflating the word with the thing it represents. So there's a conflation that happens between the words or the names that we use and the objects that we assume those names are related to. We can think of it in this case as, say, like the screen, the projector, and the process of doing that projecting and viewing of whatever is on the screen, right? The video turns out well when everything lines up, right? When there's a conflation of what is happening on the screen with reality, that's what we call a good video or a good kind of cinematic feature, right? And so the three components are the words or the names that we have to represent things, the things in themselves which we assume they represent, and our familiarization with the connection between those two things, right? How we've come to terms with the relation between those names and what we assume they relate to, right? And through that process of conflation, that's what is successful communication. That's how communication works and how we can communicate successfully.
If we look at logically, the word apple or the letter apple has nothing to do with the apple. But when we use, it works perfectly. Unless you don't make much questions, yeah? You make a general assumption and then move on. So what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about reality, we are reducing a lot of illusions. And that's why using word becomes almost like obstacles in order to explain the reality. 다 식타마 디디는 덴레기 여바르 쯤바당 디 임바르 쯤바당 디 멤버 쯤베기 쯤마 타담다 드라이베기 셈디 넬로도 또바르쇼 스니니 만남 잡샤바르도와 시간타마디.
And within this verse 12 we're talking about now, it's essentially saying, well, may we be completely free from all of these extremes that are related to any kinds of imputation regarding it being existent, non-existent, being this or being that, or not being that.
다 숨바디더니 딘데기 나와 당 동바스나 디그레 동바당 딘중스나 디그레 ngaransu nangsulla kawatatun nangbainaya denla galgamare ti mekalwe sumjuk ti tona ani ngazu sangke segware ti matona kobekyasula kokore ti intuitini tobar show sinida malam jabaretwa.
So what we have essentially is the aspiration that we recognize that appearances and emptiness are not contradictory things, right? So in general, we have these two sides of the coin being, there's the apparent aspect versus its nature being empty. Or we have this idea that there's dependent origination happening, but its nature is emptiness. It doesn't inherently exist in the way it appears. So from the normal deluded perspective, essentially that of sentient beings ourselves, we see these two things as being at odds, completely incompatible with each other. And it's because of not seeing that, in fact, these two are non-contradictory but are an indivisible unity, that we are sentient beings. And the aspiration is, may we realize that these aren't contradictions. May we realize the unity of these two, and therefore become enlightened, become awakened.
Denyi mato kowe gyaso kor, denyi tona sangye shename, tamje din dime kayame, chunyi kunshi tsane rikbar shoos.
The 13th verse reads, whoever does not realize this circles around in the ocean of samsara. However, whoever does realize this is no other than a Buddha. Everything is altogether free from it is this or it is not this. May we know the secret nature of Dharmata, the ground of all.
Simki niluk tona sangye dugore, tul dugore, simki niluk de matona tini ngaranzu tul yungore sumpare.
By realizing the nature, by realizing the way things are, one is liberated. One becomes a Buddha, an awakened being. By not realizing that, by not realizing the way things are, the nature, we fall into confusion and are sentient beings.
Natendeki semki niluk de la chunyi kunshi sene labare. Tachedang azu kunshi se di ni yore tadubke kapsula yang kunshi se chidang chachen la sope kapsula kunshi se di tini dordina tanda kunshi se labdi di tini kare se gore shetam chigi chunyi jorba niluk jorba ing dela tini kunshi sene mingta shabar karesna tamje ing dele zu yungo yoba songsa ani chang rikbar shoks la kaso degi nega jorba dendeki tini semgi rangshingi ne kare yimbati ani ngarazu tobar shos malam jabaredwa.
So here in the 13th verse, we have this term, the ground of all. May we know the secret nature of Dharmata, the ground of all. So this secret nature of Dharmata in this case is a reference, is another way that we can talk about the nature of the mind. The nature of the mind is what we mean by Dharmata. Dharmata can be translated as maybe just the way of, or the nature of Dharma, the nature of things. And it's being equated with the term the ground of all. We normally call this the alaya vijnana, the all-ground consciousness. The all-ground consciousness can be interpreted in a couple different ways. We can talk about it from the perspective of the different tenet systems that we have, the different tiers of views that we find in Buddhism, versus how we might find it talked about or spoken about within the Mahamudra tradition. Here, in this case, we're talking about from the Mahamudra's perspective, meaning that the alaya vijnana, this ground of all, this all-ground consciousness, essentially means that it is the very nature of reality. It's the very nature of all things, and that it completely pervades, or is the very Dharma Dhatu. It's the expansive space that is inherent as being the nature of all reality. So it's by realizing this particular point, it's by recognizing this vital point of the mind that would allow us to become awakened. So we're making the aspiration that we do recognize, know the secret nature of this nature of mind.
Tela tene ngazu namgyu ye dengi kunshi sini tani yorba ye dengi kunshi.
In this case, the all-ground consciousness in this particular perspective, or in this circumstance, is the all-ground consciousness that is the primordial all-ground consciousness. That's how we can understand it in this particular case. The actual ultimate all-ground consciousness.
Tadini shibati taweki donda chasante matini don to dubare nayang semla toyang semeti tokyang semla tuyang rangas gekyang semla gakyang sempe todo tamje semla chobar shos.
The next verse 14 in the prayer is a summary of the view. We've been talking about the establishment of the view, and so this verse 14, summarizes it, or it gives it the brief teaching, summarizes the meaning of what we mean by the view. And it goes, appearance is mind, emptiness is also mind, realization is mind, confusion is also mind, birth is mind, cessation is also mind. May we cut through all doubts about mind.
Tadortina ngaranzo ke sim latini da mena mangbu chungore tusate chasang sim ki kana tugres penna nawa diang sim res chulba diang sim res dendam tongba diang sim ki nilures tani di tokwa de la sangye segore diang sim res tani de mato ni ngoma she ni chulba de la korwa segore diang sim res ta tordina chulba dang chulba korwa dang yang de tasang ge tusati semla tu de ge yobainde tani ngaran so yang tawe ken tenla pha yombe kapsula rodo che yombe kapsula tini nawa sem tongba songju detam che yang tini tusati zawa sem gi tengni jungba tang semla tu ge yobati tang sem gi tengno ta chu go yobati ani nganzula yago chi go gore tela tini karesegasna tawen rodo che ba sene da dende rodo che yonde samala ngaranzula tini thardula sem songju toda yimba che la ngeshe ke songba ina tela tini yangda be tawa sigore.
So this verse is stating simply that all different kinds of appearances, experiences, what have you, are all based on the mind. It's all coming from the mind that all these things appear to us and are experienced. And with that said, the implication is that it all comes down to the mind. The mind is the vital point, the source that we need to come to terms with. And it expresses this by saying that all appearances, even all kinds of displays that we experience, as well as all kinds of confusions, are essentially the mind. Ultimately, it being completely empty of nature, this expresses the nature of the mind, so it comes back down to the mind. If we recognize that, we become enlightened, we become awakened Buddhas, and that as well, that awakening is also mind. By not recognizing the nature, we experience confusion and samsaric experience. That as well is nothing other than the mind. So all confusion, as well as all liberation, awakening, all of samsara versus all of nirvana, all of these things come down to the mind. And so when it comes to ascertaining, coming to terms with the view, we need to rid ourselves of all deluded projections, exaggerations that come with the view. And that is done by recognizing first that all appearances are the mind itself is empty, and these are not contradictory, but a indivisible unity. And so the vital thing to undertake from this is that it all comes down to the mind. The mind is the vital source, the vital point of all of these experiences. And the aspiration here is, may we cut through all doubts about the mind. Because this is the case, because it all comes down to the mind, any kinds of exaggerations or doubts or projections that we have about the mind is not beneficial, but we need to completely separate or clear away any doubts that we have about the mind. And by recognizing the simplicity or the freedom from extremes, the nature, this individual, the indivisible unity, we establish the authentic view. And with that, we have complete confidence in that.
Rangi rangi goingi rangi raiki dayang inse sunge liang kimzen dinzo la kone sungbare susu simdi dakpo kyapshi bejo tangshe na goncha digore susu simdi bejo tangmashe dakpo kyapmashe na dacha digore niga rangi simdi cha digore indi sanje ge yang rangi simni yongsu tu dini sanje temba ins tamaga domdi kyapshana wa.
And so it's for this very reason that the Buddha stated that you are your own protector. Also, you are your own enemy. Because it all comes down to this mind that we have. If we know how to use it, if we know how to utilize it, if we understand what it is, then we become our own protectors. If we don't know what it is, if we don't know how to utilize it, if we can't recognize what it is, we become our own enemies. That's again why the Buddha said that all of my teachings come down to taming one's own mind. That's why it all comes down to the mind.
Tawa tenla pap sedu ani nawa sem tongba sungjuk la tenla pape koni teni tardu di sungjuk yimba tila ngishe ke sangba ina ngishe tila tawa segore teni nyamlin jebe kapsulata jidang sumga hakoku nyamlin jebe kapsulata rimba shindo teni tangbo di nawa sem yimba la samlo tani rimba shindo tokwa tela teni tawa tenla papa.
So in summary, this is what we mean by establishing the view. That first, we recognize that all appearances are essentially the mind. Then, that the mind is inherent or essentially empty, and that appearance and emptiness are a indivisible unity. So ultimately, we need to come to the final point where we recognize that appearance and emptiness are a unity. And when we have certainty about that, when we have no doubts, all doubts are cleared away, and we have an inalterable, inalienable certainty about that, trust in that, that is what we mean by the view. And so when we're practicing, and in the beginning we need to have an understanding of what these three steps are. But when it comes to practicing, we need to go step by step, establishing each of these three stages. And with that, there's no doubt that we will establish the view. And so this is what we mean by coming to terms or establishing the view.
Tangbo tapena ngazu lobjong changi yore jambatela samlo tang susu nyowa tang ti su jarni den semde kandire to nawa sem redo maredo usna tayongde goveta wachilo le ki yore tini goveta wati ke tini tos chi chekom chine tini nyongwe tawa ke tini kale kom ne kala kangsam chine tini tobe tawa se ni ke yong go re tobe tawa te halam tawa kin dibu da re dwa ta ta na di azu ko chu sa di gowe tawa ni ya to go re ta gowe tawa de lebar che bala to zo chi ngazu chekom che nyamnin nawa sem re pa sung sha ba ngoni redu mare du sune so gatu du 상보단 태두 년바단 태두 되는 딱고 거래.
So in the beginning, we're starting with a conceptual understanding, right? This is the view that is aroused by or is coming to terms with the view via conceptual understanding. We can't immediately give rise to the ultimate recognition, the ultimate realization that is the view, the final stage, the fruition. That doesn't immediately happen. But what needs to happen before that is a conceptual understanding that is ascertained through study and contemplation. Not only that, but having some experience through meditation, analytical meditation, etc., by actually applying these and saying, well, is it the case really or not that all appearances are essentially in mind? We question that. We use what we've studied, the processes of study to aid in that. And then with using that information, we practice using analytical meditation, we gain some experience, and then ultimately the fruition of all of that, when we've actually familiarized ourselves and come to an alternable experience of that, that's what we mean by realization. That's the fruition. That's the result of all of the effort that comes into taking into account the study and experience of meditation, and then the fruition of that actual ultimate realization. And so now we're starting with this conceptual view, right? And it's our job now to practice it by analyzing whether or not it is true that all of these steps of coming to terms with the view are correct, whether or not, and we can do this by saying, well, when I meet with difficult situations, when I meet with nice, agreeable situations, is it still true, right? You're saying, well, is it? Can I maintain this understanding in any kind of situation that I find myself in? And that strengthens one's practice and understanding. So in the beginning, we start with this conceptual view, this conceptual understanding. Then we slowly gain some experience in that, and that becomes the view of experience. And then ultimately, as step by step, we will reach eventually the view of realization, the ultimate fruitional realization. So now we've completed our discussion of how we ascertain the view.
Janjo semjo rimbo je mage banam ge gyuren je ge ba nyambara me ba gongne gondo belvare sho